but hello in any case. I'm going to talk about the fast-acting and powerful biocidal properties of copper and the compounds and its compounds that made it an important element in pharmacological texts from antiquity forward. Oh, I have to press that. There we go. In the past century, however, the use of copper in other metallic medicines had been diminishing steadily owing to the development of safer antibiotics until copper began to enjoy something of a renaissance, as it has been as it has been shown to be effective against some antibiotic-resistant bacteria, including MRSA. Very recently, research indicates that it's also a promising agent in the battle against COVID. This paper will explore the possibility that copper's therapeutic properties could have been known in prehistory and then trace its known use in principally Greek and Roman medical traditions. And it will end with a short summary of the resurgence of the biocidal uses of copper in this century. It's difficult to overstate the importance of metals in the development of complex societies. As Killick and Fenn note, the quest for metals has been a major driver of exploration, long-distance trade, colonization, and imperialism. Contrary to the narrative common among many historians, however, the initial quest for metals may have arisen not from their functionality as tools after the development of smelting, which permitted the exploitation of their strength, but much earlier, from the appeal of their color, luster, tonality, or other sensual quality when they were still in their native state. This is the argument of scholars of archaeometallurgy, and their evidence is the much earlier appearance in the archaeological record of metals used in art, music, jewelry, and other sensual and aesthetic pursuits than of metal used for weapons and other tools. Since most historians are, by contrast, accustomed to dividing periods of prehistory and history by metallic ages based on the ability of a given society to exploit the metal for practical rather than aesthetic purposes, they generally don't consider for how long a metal may actually have been familiar to any given human society. By current convention, the Paleolithic, which is the Old Stone Age, runs from the earliest evidence for the Homo genus, which is 2.5 million years ago. Our own species is young by contrast. We are merely 315,000 years old. So it goes from 2.5 million years ago until about 10,000 BCE, when the Neolithic, that is the New Stone Age, begins, together with the advent of the domestication of plants and animals. The Chalcolithic, which is the Copper or Copper Stone Age, the Bronze Age, and then the Iron Age follow. As with the Neolithic, these ages begin at different times in different places. And I just want to show you a map. I'm going to be talking about places that will be extremely familiar to many people in the audience, but perhaps not terribly familiar to everyone. So I just thought I would put that up there. I'll be referring to these places as we go along. The earliest evidence for the smelting of copper, which gives the Chalcolithic its name, is from around 5000 BCE in what are now Serbia and Iran. And somehow Iran is not, oops, that was not meant to happen. Is Iran showing? Let me, yes, there's Iran. Okay, all the way to the right. So gives the Chalcolithic its name. The earliest smelting of iron is in what are now Serbia and Iran in 5000 BCE. So their Chalcolithic begins then. The earliest date for the Bronze Age is roughly 3000 BCE, and the very earliest evidence for the Iron Age is approximately 1800 BCE, though iron does not come into anything close to common use until well after 1000 BCE in most places, and in some regions, centuries after that. For Italy, we have fascinating evidence for a well-established Chalcolithic by way of a copper axe found near the remains of Utsi the Iceman, as he's called. Utsi was murdered around 3300 BCE in the Alps, in the Italian Alps, and his body was left to be naturally mummified by the ice. Near his body was found this rather magnificent copper-headed axe. The copper is nearly pure and came from a mine in central Italy. Why such a valuable object was left behind remains a mystery, but it suggests that Utsi was a man of some standing in his community and that the source of the copper was from hundreds of miles away is revealing of trade connections at this period and of course of the value of copper. So of the metals, copper wins first place because it is far easier to smelt than iron, and tools could be produced from it in earlier periods than could tools from iron. But iron, which is far more common than copper, iron is nearly ubiquitous, had wide use in human society stretching far back into prehistory. In fact, it was used as a pigment for 300,000 years before the technology to smelt it was developed. That would be in the form of red ochre primarily. The image I'm showing you of one of the magnificent cave paintings from Lascaux hardly goes back that far, just a mere 17,000 years, but the red pigment is in it. It is of the very sort found in those far older sites. So if we were to create our prehistoric and historic ages based on aesthetics rather than pragmatics, the Iron Age would far precede the copper. One argument of this paper will be that the medicinal properties of metallic minerals could have been discovered during this aesthetic period. This is necessarily speculative because we have no written text and the archaeological record is not likely to give us proof. But I believe it is worth considering nonetheless, as at least in the case of copper, on which I'll be focusing, the likelihood of accidental discovery of its medicinal properties by those handling it is high, and the time period in which this could have happened is fairly long and with many people involved. I think I can show that it is far likelier that copper's medicinal properties were discovered in the earlier stages of its adoption by humans than thousands of years later when its usefulness in making tools had been discovered, or later still, when it first shows up in Near Eastern and Egyptian medical texts. First, however, I'd like to be more explicit about definitions, since the terminology related to minerals may not be familiar and can be confusing. A mineral is a crystalline solid formed from a single uniform substance that cannot be reduced to simpler chemical components. Minerals arise mainly through inorganic processes, though scientists now recognize that some organic processes also result in minerals. The human body, for instance, produces the chief mineral components of bones and teeth. Examples of minerals are gold, diamonds, ice, and copper. Some minerals contribute to the formation of rocks, and rocks are usually composed of several minerals. The word ore is more of an economic term than a scientific one, as it refers to an aggregate of minerals usually embedded in rock and found in sufficient quantity to be mined and processed profitably. Smelting is the extraction of metals from ore by heating them to the point of melting. Like ore, metal is not a strictly scientific term either. It refers to a type of mineral that has properties humans value, including high density, malleability, and luster. Gold, silver, and copper are among the metallic minerals. Alloys of metallic minerals, whether they occur naturally or artificially, are also metals. The term metal is clearly more subjective than the term mineral, as the attributes of a metal relate in some degree to its appeal or usefulness to humans, or in the case of alloys, even to its manipulation by humans, and not, like mineral, to its definition in strictly chemical terms. A native metal is a metal found in natural deposits in pure form or naturally alloyed with other metals. Native metals were the only ones which humans were able to use before the development of smelting. Gold, silver, copper, and platinum are among the few native metals found in any great quantity because they resist the deteriorating effects of oxidation. Copper oxidizes, but unlike rust, the patina bonds with the copper and protects it from further deterioration. Native copper in the form of the blue and green minerals malachite, chrysocolla, azurite, turquoise, and dioptase is found in 12th and 11th millennia BCE contexts in the Near East and Iran, and had spread throughout Iran and the Levant by the 8th millennium. The earliest evidence for the use to which these eye-catching blue and green compounds were put is a 9th millennium find of copper that had been pounded and reheated for use in ornamentation. As mentioned above, we get our first evidence for the smelting of copper, and thus its possible pragmatic use for tools, from Serbia and Iran in circa 5000 BCE. That is 6,000 years after the earliest evidence for the distribution of native copper compounds in the Near East and Iran. While I will be discussing later on in this paper the fuller and more secure evidence that knowledge of the medicinal properties of copper may have, while I will be discussing later on in this paper the fuller and more secure evidence that knowledge of the medicinal properties of copper may have had miners and metal workers as the source, please bear in mind that such properties could easily have become known to those societies in possession of native copper compounds for up to 6,000 years prior to the advent of copper metallurgy, as copper requires no special preparation to be an effective biocide. The quest for metals that arose from their attractiveness, of course, continued in even greater earnest after the required expertise for tool making was developed, and that, of course, was smelting. This drive to obtain metals would have stimulated shipbuilding and every other aspect of any ancient economy involved with trade, and would have promoted the diplomatic and other steps required for maintaining safer trade routes. In other words, commodities as valuable as gold, silver, iron, copper, and tin very likely provided the incentive to develop both cross-cultural relationships and intracultural systems. And I'm showing you here a replica of the famous Uluburun shipwreck, which was from the late 14th century and was carrying 10 tons of raw copper and 1 ton of tin, along with many other items. So this freight that the Uluburun shipwreck was carrying is stunning testimony to this fact. For the Bronze Age and for the Iron Age, John Papadopoulos points to the Odyssey, where the ore-loving Taphians are said to sail across the sea to southern Italy to trade iron for copper. Beyond that, as Papadopoulos also argues, it is hard to imagine a more profound shaper of societies than coinage. When once a society is creating relative value with metal coins as the basis of comparison, it's clear that metals have a special significance in that society. This special significance extended to the notion in Greek thought that metals and minerals more generally were endowed with a degree of vitality, perhaps in anticipation of alchemical theories. The early human races in the poet Hesiod are metallic. The blacksmith god Hephaestus creates animate servants and guard dogs of gold and silver. And the pre-Socratic philosopher Thales, and centuries of philosophers, scientists, and magicians after him, sought to explain the apparent life force in magnets. In his work on stones, Theophrastus attributed forces or powers, the Greek word is dynamis, to metals and minerals, while a dunamis, that is a force or a power, may sometimes in Theophrastus mean nothing more than characteristic or property. It more commonly refers to an ability, not a static quality. The same word is frequently used in medical works regarding the efficacy attributed to medicinal plants. All of these observations are relevant to a discussion of the sources for the Greeks' knowledge of copper's medicinal properties, since it is a metal found rarely in mainland Greece. Mainland Greeks imported much of their copper from Cyprus, which had one of the largest troves of native copper in that part of the world. But new analyses show that at least some copper was being imported from Jordan. Given that, it is likely that knowledge of copper metallurgy came into Greece from neighboring regions, as did that other metal needed for producing bronze, namely tin. Not surprisingly, therefore, the Greek word for copper, bronze, and other copper alloys, chalkos, is not Indo-European. Its origin is likely to be Eastern and connected with chalcos, the word for purple. I believe that we may reasonably conclude that at least some therapeutic uses of copper, arguably known for millennia by the peoples of the regions where it could be found in large quantities in its native form, came into Greece when the metal was imported, and perhaps again in tandem with the that's the wrong slide, with the technical skill of metallurgy. Whoops, I'm sorry, I have the wrong slide there. Well, let's go. There's what we need. Egyptian cosmetic and medicinal use of copper and copper compounds has been well documented from the Bronze Age forward, and Greek medicine very likely owes some of its knowledge to the Egyptians. And so here we have an example of Ramesses VI, all in the 12th century BCE, with that heavy black eyeliner that was made of partly from a copper compound called malachite. And they produced this eyeliner, which is known as kohl. It's very possible that the use of this eyeliner might have helped protect the Egyptians who used it against eye infections, which were they were very common all over the ancient world, but I think they were probably especially common in Egypt, which was so dry and dusty. And here I just put in little kohl containers that I just thought were kind of nice. And I thought it was kind of striking the spread of time, from, perhaps the 16th or 15th or 14th century BCE, all the way to possibly 400 CE. It's quite a spread of time. So all of these observations are relevant to a discussion of the sources for the Greeks' knowledge of copper's medicinal properties, since it is I'm sorry, I've read that already. Okay, back on track here. Particularly noteworthy for Egyptian medicine is case 6 of the Edwin Smith Papyrus, which mentions copper in an unusual simile. The folds of the brain are likened to the corrugations of molten copper in the crucible. The successful use of this simile relies upon doctors having direct contact with metal workers, perhaps to obtain an unadulterated copper for their medicines, as we know Galen traveled to a mine to do centuries later. And I know that Professor Michaelides talked about this in the last seminar. Then too, the Greek herbalist Laskaris gives a description of certain metallurgic processes that sound very like eyewitness accounts. Doctors would also have encountered metal workers when they bought their instruments, since these were highly specialized tools that were almost certainly made to order, such as the ones on the left, which I'm sorry for the bad photos, the only one I've ever been able to find. This is from a 15th century BCE burial in Nafplio. And then on the right, or above, I guess, are the far more recent ones from Rimini, 3rd century CE. And as you can see, there's a lot of similarity in them. And in fact, there's a lot of similarity, some things you could find in a doctor's office today. The dunamis of copper very likely underlies the 1st century Roman naturalist Pliny's observation when he served as procurator of a Roman province in what is now Spain, that wounds that occur in copper mines heal very quickly. It would be surprising, therefore, if the earliest miners had not made the same observation themselves, given the occupational hazards they faced. We know of likely medical self-help among early metal workers in another context. Robert Arnott has proposed that Bronze Age metal workers concocted the first known compound medicine in Greece, perhaps to treat the arsenical poisoning to which their jobs would have made them vulnerable. And just as the workers Pliny mentions are very likely to have stumbled upon the basic fact that copper possesses fast-acting properties helpful in the treatment of wounds, so might have those peoples who had as much as 6,000 years between the time they were using copper for ornamentation and the time when it was smelted and used in the manufacture of weapons and other tools. I'm suggesting, in other words, that there may have been functionality in the so-called aesthetic period as well, functionality of a therapeutic sort. The Greek pharmacological tradition makes ample use of copper and other minerals. Metallic medicines are found in numerous works of the Hippocratic Corpus, which is a collection of 60 to 70 texts of unknown authorship from mainly the classical period that were all attributed to Hippocrates at one point. These eventually, as I say, got attributed to Hippocrates, but we know today that they are by many authors and were written over a period of roughly 130 years. Included among the volumes mentioning metallic medicines are gynecological texts, some of which are among our oldest prose texts in Greek. In general, we find metallic medicines called for in wound treatment, including surgical wounds, and wherever a need for cleaning is emphasized. Among the most noteworthy passages is one in Book 2 of Diseases, where flour of copper is to be applied to the surgical site after a tonsillectomy. A little later on in Diseases 2, flour of copper is considered a superior treatment, as it is to be used to make pus break out if an infusion of acids or goat's milk does not work. Sometimes copper remedies take the place of more drastic measures. This is the case in the treatise Hemorrhoids, section 7 to 8, where treatments calling for copper ore, flour of copper, and verdigris are recommended to avoid cautery and excision. In the treatise called On Sight, there's a significant passage in my view, passage 4 to 5. Here, the scarified eyelid is to be treated, quote, with one of the moist medications consisting of flour of copper, end quote. I find it telling that there are apparently numerous and familiar medications with flour of copper, and that flour of copper is clearly viewed as the principal ingredient. A little later on in the same treatise, flour of copper, scale of copper, and a copper vessel are all part of the recommendations for treating eye problems. In the Hippocratic treatise Ulcers, we have several passages that call for medicines with copper and other metals in them to treat skin lesions. And there's one unusual passage that specifies that a copper vessel is to be used for mixing the medicines, which are to be stirred in such a way that some of the copper enters into the mixture. In this section too, we find a recipe calling for flour of copper that is lauded as superior to the one preceding it. And we find copper frequently used in conjunction with two other foreign ingredients with antimicrobial properties, namely myrrh and frankincense. By the Hellenistic period, mineral medicines were a well-established category. In the Aristotelian Problemata, a wound is said to heal more quickly if it was inflicted by a bronze instrument rather than an iron one, in part because bronze has healing properties, so that the medicine, the text says, is applied together with the infliction of the wound. And that's a passage that reminds me of the myth of Telephus, right, where the thing that caused the wound is the thing that does the healing. Pliny wrote extensively about the medicinal uses of copper. I can provide only a summary of what he says here. It is generally that copper and several minerals containing it saw wide use in wound treatment and in eye salves. And Pliny remarks on how very quickly sores are healed by copper. Copper scale and flour had additional uses in treating dropsy, hearing loss, and swellings in any part of the body, and copper pyrites in treating sexual organs and stopping hemorrhages. So far, these are all topical uses, but Pliny mentions two copper-containing minerals that were taken internally. Chrysocolla, which is probably copper carbonate, was used as an emetic that the Greeks called akasis, which means healing. And Cyprian flour of copper, which had the usual uses in eye remedies and wound treatments, but was also touted by Pliny for purging intestinal worms. In addition, and here's where the slide that's out of order comes up. Here we go. In addition, Pliny tells us of an invention flour of copper had been found to be such a strong astringent that sprinkled in their mouths, it made the bears and lions used in the gladiatorial games unable to bite. It remains unclear to me how one managed to get the flour of copper sprinkled into the mouths of the bears and lions to begin with, but perhaps we can get an idea from this scene, which I've kind of stolen from a meme that was circulating around online. It showed Heracles, many photos of Heracles with the Nemean lion, which is what, of course, this is, wrestling with the Nemean lion. And it says, and the caption is Hercules trying to pill his cat. So I kind of stole the idea from them, I'm sorry to say. Anyway. Finally, the famous and influential Galen, a Greek doctor and researcher working in the Roman Empire, and indeed for the Emperor Marcus Aurelius and his family, devotes a long section of his survey of pharmaceuticals on simples to metallic medicines, that's 9.3, and includes several copper-based items. As mentioned above, Galen pays a personal visit to the copper mine at Soli on Cyprus to obtain copper-based ingredients that he can be sure are the real thing, because there's always the concern for adulteration. So to come to the present moment, as I mentioned at the outset, copper has lately seen a resurgence in its use as a biocide. Studies from the past decade have shown copper to have powerful antimicrobial properties that are apparent even from its use on touch surfaces. As one researcher notes, quote, bacteria, yeasts, and viruses are rapidly killed on metallic copper surfaces, and the term contact killing has been coined for this process, end quote. Copper and its alloys have been shown to be effective against even MRSA and E. coli and Clostridium difficile. And copper has now been registered with the United States Environmental Protective Agency as an antimicrobial substance. COVID has brought a new urgency to this work. On February 10th of this year, the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, announced that copper alloys that were at least 95.6% copper provide long-term effectiveness against SARS-CoV-2, that is the virus that causes COVID-19. The tests conducted demonstrated that such alloys kill 99.9% of the virus within 2 hours and retain their biocidal properties for an extended period, possibly even years, although obviously that hasn't been able to be tested yet. But by way of comparison, COVID remains viable on stainless steel for several days, so 2 hours versus several days. Microbiologist Bill Keevil of the University of Southampton in the UK has been researching copper's antimicrobial properties for 2 decades. The only thing that surprises him about this new research is that COVID survived for as long as 2 hours, because when he tested copper against the bacteria that cause Legionnaire's disease, MRSA, Middle East respiratory syndrome, that is to say MERS, and swine flu, that's H1N1, and also coronavirus 229E, which is a relative of COVID-19, what he said was, quote, copper killed the pathogen within minutes. It just blew it apart. And copper has staying power. When Keevil's team tested the century-old copper railings of New York's Grand Central Terminal, they found that the copper had just as much antimicrobial punch as it had the day it was installed. Because of its fast-acting, powerful, and long-lasting properties, copper is being recommended for coating hospital touch surfaces, door and faucet handles, for example, but also the hard surfaces around a patient's bed, such as the railings and the side panels, or any other nearby surfaces frequently touched by patients. Because there, as I'm sure everyone knows, there's a tremendous concern about hospital spread infections. And one of the big reservoirs for having bacteria and viruses, are the patients themselves. So especially patients who are staying long-term or who are very vulnerable in an intensive care or something, you know, they're touching things all around their bed and the side table and all of that. And they themselves could be, you know, leaving pathogens behind to be picked up later. So in conclusion, I believe that it's reasonable to assume that from the earliest times that humans came into regular contact with copper in its native state, they were able to learn of its biocidal properties. Certainly the miners and metal workers of later periods would have been able to observe precisely what Pliny did, that wounds exposed to copper heal quickly. We have ample evidence that Greek and Roman doctors were not averse to learning from such traditions, that is to say, from non-experts, even if they rationalized them into their own systems. Indeed, in the case of copper, they would have been denying themselves a powerful antibiotic and styptic had they done so. And that is the end.
Thank you so much, Julie.
Mm-hmm.
Maria, shall we stop the recording now, or?
Yes, we could stop the recording.
Okay.